Welcome back. Now, at the very simplest level, mastering is generally control of tone, mostly via EQ, and control of dynamics, usually by compressors, limiters, or other means as well. So in this video, we're going to look at EQ, just the most simple, basic way of shaping the tone of a track. Now, what we've got in front of us here is a track that I mixed back when I was living with my parents in my bedroom in the early 90s. So this track, due to my limited skill set in those days and the technology of the day, is a little bit dull, lacking in excitement, but a good effort for a kid working on a Porter Studio and I think a 2-track hard disk machine at that stage. It was the very, very early days of Pro Tools, probably Sound Tools if I'm not mistaken. Over on this side is a mix done maybe 10 years after that on a Pro Tools system. So this mix over here, while not brilliant, does have a nice kind of clean, sparkly top end. Let's just drop in the middle and have a little listen to that. Anyway, anytime you call. Okay, so it might be a little shy on the bass, but you can hear it's nice and bright and sparkling up the top. Need the time you take. Okay, now let's have a little listen to this one by comparison. It's got the old-fashioned drum loops that were very common in the early 90s. So by comparison, it feels very, very dull compared to this one. So the obvious thing we would do here is EQ the top end quite aggressively on this track. But something to keep in mind with mastering when you're talking about EQ, generally work in broad brush strokes, nice wide curves. Unlike mixing where you can do sharp notch type filters, the same things don't usually work terribly well in mastering because they're too narrow for such broad program material. So let's get into EQing this track now. Now in this world of plugins aplenty, there's plenty of EQ choices. So in the case of myself, I've probably got about 15 different EQs I could choose. Generally, you would choose the cleanest EQ you could manage, though sometimes you want a deliberately kind of coloured or distorted type of EQ with a vibe about it. But one I usually go to first off is the Massenburg 5-band EQ here in Pro Tools. Now, of course, it doesn't matter what workstation you're using, what plugins you've got or haven't got. I'm going to have a whole bunch of stuff you haven't got. You've probably got a whole bunch of stuff I haven't got. Doesn't matter. Principles are all the same. This is just a standard 5-band parametric EQ. This one just happens to be a big favourite of mine. So what I'll do is drag this other file down onto a clean track so it can be the clean one. So I'll just create a stereo track under there and drag my control track down there. Okay, so let's get started. Now, we know our dilemma is that this track is much too dull. This one, let's for the sake of the argument say, it sounds balanced and it's what we're trying to emulate. Now, the reality of that is near impossible because it's a totally different sounding track done at a much higher level. But as mentioned in previous tutorials, we've talked about having to get a consistency from track to track, even if the tracks themselves are widely different. So the way I want to attack this initially is to use these two bands here, the two highest bands of the EQ. This one is set to a shelf, this one's set to a peak dip. Now, I want to start with a fairly low point on the shelf because it is a dull sounding track. It's dull quite low, shall we say. It doesn't need just sparkle up at the 10-15k area. It's dull through that kind of high mid-range as well. So I'm going to set my high shelf down as low as maybe 2 or 3k even. So let's set it to 3k. So I'll drag that down there and we'll have a little play of this while I push that up. And I'm guessing I'd probably need at least 2 or 3 dB down there, if not more, just to open up that top end brightly. So a shelf working this way does conform to what I was saying about broad brush strokes and hopefully not too aggressive. So let's have a listen. So I'm pushing this up now and you can see it's a big step happening there. And there's 3 dB. So just turning that on and off will be a big difference. Okay, so let's just leave it there for now. So that's 3 dB on a 3K shelf. Now with this one here, I want to pick a frequency that can kind of refocus the track a little bit in the high mids. So it's not necessarily that I'm trying to make it vastly brighter or anything like that. I'm trying to almost create a bit of an illusion by finding a frequency that speaks well in the track, if there is one, hopefully, and bring that forward more to give the illusion of brightness and presence. So I'm guessing it's somewhere between the 2 and 4K area. So I'll just bring that down to there to start with. And we'll push this up maybe 5 or 6 dB, so exaggerate it, while we search around to find that area that doesn't sound harsh and ugly, hopefully, and just refocuses the presence in the track. So let's have a listen. So it's a bit squawky. Let's go up. And now, too ugly there. So down from there. Maybe around there. Okay, and now instead of 6.4, as you can see, let's bring that down to something a bit more sensible like 2 or 3. So let's have a listen to that now at 3. Okay, now let's compare that to the other track quickly as well and just see if we're in the vague ballpark of just how present the top end is. We're never going to get it as smooth as the other track, but let's just see if we're in the ballpark. And again. Okay, well, as far as we could expect with something like this, I think we're nearly there. But here's the big issue, of course. Now, EQ is a static process, as you can imagine. You put this over something and everything gets affected by that curve. Now, this is a track that has that hallmark of amateur mixing. The most obvious thing in an amateur mix is that frequencies are not balanced. Now, that track has that aggressive, horrible tambourine loop going over and over again, which is way too bright. We've got a track which is way too dull, with a tambourine loop that is way too bright. So that is a mastering conundrum 101 there, because a basic EQ, whatever we do, is going to affect that in a negative way. We turn the brightness up, we over brighten that tambourine loop. Turn the brightness down, well, you wouldn't do that, would you? Because the track's so dull to start with. So you're locked in a little bit of a corner there. Now, there are some ways we can punch ourselves out of that corner, and we'll discuss those in later tutorials. But right now, we've got an EQ problem. So all we can do is a kind of a best guess thing where the tambourine is not too obnoxiously bright, but at least we can get some life back in the track. Now, that is as opposed in an EQ situation to this track here, which of course is not the greatest mix ever made, but at least it has that one professional trait of consistency. It's relatively even. So whatever we do to this track will affect everything evenly, and nothing is going to react, hopefully, in a bad way to that. So for instance, I could argue this track's probably lacking a little bit in bottom end. Let's just check again. Yeah, you could say it's a little bit thin down at the bottom. So what I'm going to do is grab this EQ, I'll make a copy of that over there, and then we'll just zero out this copy. So we're back to a flat EQ there now. Now, if I EQ some bottom end into this track, I'm fairly confident that at least it's going to be consistent. It's not going to make a specific element jump out ahead of everything else because of an imbalance that exists in the mix ahead of time. So let's have a listen to that. I'll do the same thing in reverse that we did to the other track. So the shelf down here. Okay, I'll push that up a little bit just to warm it up. Okay, too much. Try that. And now using this next one up here, this bell curve, I'm going to try and find a spot that complements the bottom end. Maybe if I can find the center of the kick or something like that to just bring up some presence in the track, but this time in the bottom end. So I'll be guessing around 80 to start with. And I'll hunt around. Maybe a bit more. Okay, well the point is here, I don't want to go too high because then I start muddying things up, and if you go too low and miss the mark, then you're sort of not affecting anything. But let's pull this down to, again, like a 2 dB thing, and let's hear the difference now. We'll go bypass. See, suddenly way too thin again. So back on. Probably a little bit too much, but let's pull it back. But you can see these sorts of numbers are the things you're normally dealing with in mastering. These are quite low numbers. I mean, if you're a mixer yourself, you know that you're often EQing things quite aggressively in mixing. In mastering, it's often little baby steps like this. So even on this other track, I mean, 3 dB and 3 dB here don't seem like big numbers in a mixing realm, but in mastering, that's huge. They're quite big steps done to a very, very dull sounding track. So just to get your head around the kind of smaller dimension we're working in mastering. So let's listen to our 2 tracks now. They're still going to be miles apart, of course. Let's see if we've made some steps in the positive direction. So vastly different, but at least you could hear them one after the other in a context and understand what's going on. So that's EQing. Obviously for problem tracks like that, we're going to need some more aggressive tools, and that's something we will be dealing with, as I said, in later tutorials. But next up, we're going to have a look at mix bus compression, and I'll catch you in that movie.